Good morning. I am hoping by now, into our third week, that things are going to become somewhat familiar to you as we continue to go on. We're basically beginning each week with this home slide, if you like, that gives us an overview of what we're doing. This is the Old Testament that we're talking about, from the time of Abraham to the time of waiting, the time as a preparation for Jesus. We're in our third week now for you who are guests and visitors, and this kind of gives us an overview. At the top you see a timeline there, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Underneath that there is a map, 4 rivers, 3 seas, and 2 cities, which you will, if you're not by now, become familiar with. There'll eventually be a test, so pay attention, okay? 4 rivers, 3 seas, and 2 cities. These are the important geographical areas and things that you need to know about as we look at the Holy Lands. Underneath of that, you see what is the promise to Abraham. And that begins with the promise of descendants, as many as stars in the sky, if you can count them, the Lord says. It is the promise of land, and it is the land that we're talking about now today, of course. And finally, the promise that Abraham and his descendants will be a blessing to all the peoples. And so we're talking today about Joseph. Now, here's a timeline for you. We showed this last week as well. It begins in 2000 BC and goes all the way up to 0, if you like, or when Jesus lived. Beginning with Abraham. Abraham lived in the Middle Bronze Age, somewhere between 19 and 2100 BC. A quick way to understand the Old Testament timeline is to remember that David is at a year 1000, so evenly between Abraham and Jesus. Today we're talking about Joseph, who lived in around 1700 BC. Now, we didn't go directly from one to the other. Let's look at a brief family tree here. These things can get very complicated, as you know, so I've made this one very simple. Beginning with Noah, of course Adam and Eve came first, but we'll begin with Noah. Terah was the father of Abraham, who was the father of Isaac, who was the father of Jacob, who had 12 sons. That should sound somewhat familiar to those of you who have memories of vacation Bible schools and Sunday schools. The 12 sons of Joseph, of course, became the 12 tribes of Israel. So we're talking about Joseph today, the story of Joseph, and how it applies to the promise that God has made. Now, I'm going to use some paintings from mostly the 15th, 16th century to help us illustrate the story of Joseph, but let's see what you remember. I did this with the senior crowd, the fellowship group, on Wednesday, and they got an A+. So see what you can remember. But the story of Joseph begins, of course, Joseph had 11 brothers. And as he came, he was the favorite of his dad, remember that? And his dad showed that by giving him a coat of many colors, remember that? Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat might ring a bell, for which his brothers became very jealous. Very good. So far you're doing well, okay? But Joseph was a tattletale and a bit of a dreamer. He liked to tattletale on his brothers, and he also dreamed that his 11 brothers and even his father would someday bow down to him. I heard somebody say, I'll give you credit for that. Very good. All right? Which made his brothers very jealous. So one day, Dad says, go check up on your brothers. They're way off yonder tending their sheep, and bring me a report. So Joseph takes off, he gets out there, and his brothers, seeing him come, decide to first kill him, and then Reuben says, no, let's not kill him, let's throw him in a pit and sell him into slavery. Remember? They see the caravan coming by, they said, no, let's not kill him, let's send him into slavery, right? Here you have Joseph sold by his brethren. All right? Sold into slavery. So he's taken off to Egypt, where he's sold to Potiphar. Very good. I heard that over here. This corner is doing better than some. I think I got a ringer over here somewhere. Yeah, Lauren, that's you, isn't it? All right. Okay. sold to Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was the captain's guard, the chief of the captain's guard, the captain of the guard of Pharaoh, which meant he was part of Pharaoh's inner circle, very powerful man. Joseph was very talented and very blessed, and everything he touched turned to gold, literally. So Potiphar gave him control of his whole house. And we ask, was this training for what was to come? Joseph took over all of Potiphar's house, and everything was going really well until Potiphar's wife, very good, Potiphar's wife grabbed a hold of him. Actually, I had another painting, but we have so many kids I couldn't show that one. That would have been fun, though. Pastor Tim, I want you to know, encouraged me to do it, and I said no. There you see Potiphar's wife grabbing a hold of Joseph because she wanted, kids, talk to your parents later. And Joseph ended up in prison. Very good. He ended up in prison. All right. While in prison, he became, once again, everything he did turned out well, and he became a very big help to the jailer. The jailer came to depend upon him, and they had two very important prisoners at the time. One was the king's baker. The other was the king's, extra credit for this one, cupbearer. Who said that? Very good. Somebody said that over here. See, they're doing very well. Was the cupbearer. And they both had dreams they couldn't figure out, so they came to Joseph, and Joseph correctly interpreted them. And here is Joseph explaining the dreams. The cupbearer is on top, is standing, and he's being told that in 3 days he'll become the cupbearer again. The baker, he's kind of gray and ashen, and he doesn't like the news he heard. He heard that the Pharaoh was going to execute him, and sure enough, Joseph was correct. Time goes on. The cupbearer hears that the Pharaoh has had a dream he can't interpret, so he remembers Joseph. Pharaoh calls to Joseph and says, "Interpret my dream." Do you remember the dream? It was a dream about 7 cows. 7 were fat and 7 were skinny, and that meant there would be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of, y'all doing really well. That's great. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. The Pharaoh was so impressed that he made Joseph number 2 in all the nation, right? Number 2 in all the nation. And the story continues. Sure enough, there was a famine in the whole region. First there were 7 years of plenty, and then there were 7 years, the beginning of 7 years of famine. Now, for those of you old enough to get this next piece, we'll see. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, Jacob, of course, they're going through the famine as well, back in the Holy Lands, right? Jacob and his sons hear about the fact that there's grain in Egypt, right? And so here we have a very fun piece. Jacob sends his sons to go get grain. Well, he sends 10. He doesn't send Benjamin. Benjamin is the youngest and his favorite now. He sends 10. They get down there. They don't recognize Joseph. Joseph recognizes them. And the first thing he says is, "Where is Benjamin?" Exactly right. He's back with Dad. "I don't believe you. I think you're spies. Leave one of you here while you go back and get him, and I'll believe you." Okay, if anybody can tell me who stayed behind, I'll give him an automatic A for the year. Nice try. Simeon. I'll give you half credit. That was a good try. All right, Simeon was stayed back. 9 of them went back. Now here's where you get a little detail that's kind of fun. When the 9 brothers went back, do you remember what was put into their sacks of grain? No, the bowl came later, but good try. A sack of silver. 9 sacks of silver went back. They got back. They talked to Dad. Dad said, I don't want to send Benjamin back. They said, you have to. They ran out of grain. They sent 10 sons back, right? Simeon was released from prison. There's 11 sons there. Remember what happens next? Joseph says, okay, give them grain and send them away. Put the bag of silver in each one of the 11 sacks and add the silver cup, right? So he lets them get halfway down the road. He sends his army. They bring them back. Here's the fun part. They have been given 20 sacks of silver, which is the same amount that they got when they sold Joseph into slavery. Interesting. What's going on there? Joseph is teaching them perhaps what it feels like to be helpless and not in control. Well, finally, all 11 brothers are gathered together, and we come to our text. It's printed for you in your bulletin if you'd like to follow along. This is from Genesis chapter 45. Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, so he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" Notice the first question he asks. But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler over all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say this to him. This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. Probably the most dramatic piece of scripture in the Old Testament. The story of Joseph revealing himself to his brothers. Revealing himself to his brothers. What a drama. What a sense of you can just picture this happening, can't you? You know, if you want to go home and think about something, and any good teacher will leave you with 100 more questions than when you came, go home and think about this. Did Joseph really forgive his brothers? It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. Instead, think of it this way. Joseph said, there are 2 stories. There are 2 stories that I could tell you today. One is a story of suspicion and jealousy and slavery and false accusations and imprisonment and suffering. I could tell you that story. You already know it, but I could tell it to you. And not only that, I could take great revenge on you now for what you did to me. That's a story that could be told. But there's a second story, a story of learning, a story of waiting, a story of opportunity, a story of being ready for 13 years of suffering to do what God has placed in front of Joseph to do. And Joseph says to his brothers, that's the story I want to talk to you about, right? You only know one of the stories, Joseph says. Now let me tell you the other story. Joseph chose to turn away from the abuse that he'd suffered. He chose to turn away from the focus on suffering, instead to talk about God's activity in the midst of it all. Finally, he gets a chance not only to welcome his brothers, but to welcome his father. To welcome his father. God has promised offspring and land and blessing, and now his people have to leave the land, but God is preparing them to grow into a great nation. What is our lesson for today? I think it's this. God intervenes in human history to accomplish his own purposes. God does not cause suffering, but God uses human suffering for good. Let's look at a couple of examples. Who remembers Jacob Wetterling? All of us do. The work that his family has done with the Jacob Wetterling Foundation has done more work to help families that have lost children than we'll ever really know. There's a terrible tragedy that happened. I can't even begin to imagine what it would be like to have your son snatched off of his bicycle on a warm summer afternoon, never to see him again. But yet, what has happened from that? What has God wrought in the midst of that? Think about it. Think about what just happened in our own community with the tornadoes that went through Hugo just a few weeks ago. Total devastation. And you know what I think was the hardest part was to look to see houses almost completely untouched, with the landscaping still in place and the flowers still blooming, and next door there was a hole in the ground. What happened as a result? We lost a beautiful little girl, 2-year-old girl. But what happened as a result of that tragedy? I believe God used that for good, because people came from everywhere. Help came from everywhere. That community was inundated with people like you and I who cared enough to reach out to help. How has God intervened in your life? Where have you suffered that you found that God has made opportunity out of your suffering? We ask the question, where is God in all this? And my message for you today is that God is very present. God is very present in everything that is going on in our lives and in our world. We simply have to seek for the presence and the activity of God. What does this mean for us as a community in this time and place? First of all, I want to lift up 3 things quickly. I want you to pray for our vision of who we are becoming. A multi-generational, intentional, multi-generational faith community. We are praying to be able to welcome our seniors to live here on our campus. That's what we're praying about hard. I invite you to give thanks for the courage to care for those that are in need as we ourselves struggle in this economy. You all have responded in such wonderful ways, continually responded to those in need. Our giving levels are increased from last year. You all of us are doing a wonderful job. Today, when this is going to be announced later, I'll do it now. When you go out to your car, you're going to find a food bag underneath your windshield and a little instruction sheet on how you can help to fill our food shelf this week. I encourage you to do that. More than anything in this beautiful day, more than anything, in the midst of whatever your life is bringing, I invite you to seek joy in your life, to seek out the journey that God has laid before you, and to take joy in it. Now, next week, we're going to continue our story. The 12 tribes of Israel will grow into a mighty nation, but they'll be in slavery down in Egypt under the Pharaoh. You know this story, and what's going to happen next. God is going to act in a mighty way to deliver his people in what we call the Exodus, of course. Now, don't forget, you can go to geth.org, all right, and click on Summer Sermon Series, see a video of this sermon to see the whole thing, and to be able to watch the previous ones as well. If you've missed one, I invite you to do that as well. God's blessings to you in this week and in this day. My prayer is that we enjoy these days, because the time for the use of snow shovels is not far away, okay? With that in mind, they're hissing at me. I better get off. Go ahead.
I don't even want to touch that. I want to just mention one other thing that is available to you this coming week, and then Amber's going to come up and talk for just a minute. Come on up. There is also a summer Bible sampler that's taking place this summer. It's a very easy entry-level Bible reading and then discussion, and we're meeting this Thursday night at 7 o'clock for our first discussion time. So we'd be delighted to have you come and join us for that. Even if you don't know anything else about it, come and find out, and we can give you the materials, and you can join us in this journey of Bible reading. Take it away.
Summer has seemed like a long time in coming this year, so it is with my whole heart that I tell you, Happy Summer Sunday today.
Yay.
I saw on the, yay. I saw on the news last night that it has rained or snowed every weekend since March 15th. So let's get out and enjoy it as long as it lasts. Henry Van Dyke said, "Be glad of life because it gives you the chance to love and to work and to play and to look up at the stars." And it's in that spirit that I invite you outside after the service today to join in some summer Sunday activities. I hope that no matter what age you are and no matter what you're able to do, that you'll come out and join in the fun and have your spirit be lifted by the children and by God's presence in amongst us as we come together and care and play together. So outside today, what you will find is that we'll have 2 sessions of organized activities, one beginning as soon as we head out, and then another after we